Hi, my name is Trip Gorman, and in this episode of Semilla.VC, I sat down with Nick Grassi, the co-founder and CEO of Finerio Connect, which he likens as the plaid of Latin America. Before founding Finerio, he was a graduate of NYU and got a Fulbright scholarship to pursue an MBA in Mexico City. He then worked at Deloitte before founding Finerio with a check from the Mexican government. He talked about how Latin American tech and venture capital has changed in the last 6 years. He talked about how important it is to have a Latin American co-founder as an American founding a company in Latin America. And then he also talked about things like cultural barriers that you would face as an American co-founder in Latin America. It was an excellent conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So Nick, thank you for spending the time with us today. I just want to start out talking a little bit about Finerio Connect. So what is the fundamental gap that was missing in the Mexican or Latin American finance space before Finerio Connect? And how is Finerio Connect uniquely positioned to solve this issue?
Hey, yeah. Thanks for inviting me, Trip. Pleasure to be here. I think the problem that we were solving initially was really around people's data and their personal finances and how to best manage that in a way that was automatized, in a way that you didn't have to keep track of where you were spending money between multiple different bank accounts. And I think that issue is still an issue for people in Latin America in order to kind of better manage their personal finances and also be able to obtain things like loans and other kind of financial products. So I think that's always been the issue that we attacked as far as like from the early days when we were just an application. And then Finerio Connect really was the evolution of that, just to expand all of those capabilities to any bank or financial institution that wanted to take advantage of what we had built. So basically, being able to create the infrastructure that was necessary to be able to check anyone's bank account, verify their details, verify their income, verify their expenditures, etc., and then be able to then process that, take decisions based off of data, and even help the end user kind of have a better experience. So those are really the core of those issues are really the core of what we attack when it comes to financial infrastructure in Latin America. Why us? Because we actually started as the only application that was attacking this issue. We had 250,000 end users with our application after about a year, and yeah, nobody's really done it at scale, at the same scale that we have, especially in Spanish-speaking Latin America. There's not really been any proven solutions out there. So yeah, we're pretty excited about our positioning and how we've grown over the last year or two.
So does this issue also exist in the United States? And if so, how is it being solved here? How is it different? And would Finerio Connect thus ever expand to the United States?
No, I think in the United States, I think Plaid is doing pretty well. Has got that issue covered pretty well. I think there's actually plenty of companies that are pretty big in the US that tackle this issue, whether it's Plaid or Finicity, which was bought by MasterCard for $1 billion, or you have MX, which is another company that does this quite well. You have Yodlee. So you have a lot of competitive pressures in the United States that you don't necessarily have here.
It's very interesting. And taking it back to, you mentioned, your time in Latin America. Finerio Connect was part of one of the original TechCrunch battlefield in Latin America in 2018. How do you characterize this change in Latin America's tech and startup landscape over the past 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an incredible change. When I first got to Mexico City, there was really no such thing as e-commerce. There was a startup that was trying to attack that, but really hardly anybody had used it. There was a lot of fear around people putting in their credit card details online. You're dealing with a society with low levels of trust. There was no Uber really. It was just kind of getting off the ground. So I think that actually was a really, really big, that really exploded because, again, there wasn't a lot of trust with the taxi system that was here because of insecurity issues, overcharging issues, things like that. So I think really what started to change a lot is around trust. Like, hopefully that's really kind of where tech is leading Latin America, is to be able to instill some sort of brand that can inspire trust, and that allows people to kind of utilize their smartphones or their own data in their favor, and not have to fear of some sort of security issue or compromise or anything like that. So I think it's changed a ton. Obviously, there's also been a lot more funding that came down here in the last 5 years, and I think it's really changed the face of what people expect in terms of services in the market, and for the better.
You mentioned the funding. That was my next question. How did you go about finding the VC funding right when you started, and how has that changed since the Latin American startup space has changed? You mentioned there's more funding. How's that changed over the past couple of years? And also, what do you look for in an investor, both at the beginning and now, as that space has kind of blown up?
Yeah, I mean, when we first started, there really weren't many investors. We started around 2017, and there was really like almost nothing in terms of investment. So we actually got a fund. Our first check was actually from the government. They had a program here for supporting entrepreneurship and startups, just because there was really like nothing there. So that was really what helped us get started. And then after that, kind of starting to be able to prove more and more product market fit, we were able to go after kind of angel groups and smaller VCs and things like that that were mostly more local. And yeah, it's always been a VC is always about making connections long term. So I mean, these things don't happen overnight. I think you have to just kind of start sending updates, start sending connecting with people at different events and asking for intros and things like that. So it's very much a hustle in that regard. And then later on, as we kind of became more and more successful and pivoted towards B2B, it becomes much more institutionalized. And then, you basically are looking at fundraising a formal round and, contacting lots of VCs, doing the pitch over and over and all that type of stuff. And yeah, it's been cool to watch the ecosystem evolve and watch more and more American VCs become interested in investing in the success of Latin America. Both because I think it's got good returns, and also lower levels of competition. And you also have just a huge up and coming middle class, right? Kind of similar to what happened, in China and Asia and all that stuff. So I think investors are always looking for where's the delta, where's the next upcoming hot region, right? So I think it's become that, and I think it's a great sign for the region.
So pivoting to your own background and how that connects with Latin America, when did you fully discover your admiration for Latin America? And how did working for, you said, an NGO in Argentina, Deloitte in Mexico, and pursuing an MBA in Mexico City on a Fulbright scholarship, how did those three experiences also develop that admiration?
Yeah, well, it was always an interest of mine because where I grew up in Hudson County, New Jersey, was very, very Latino to begin with. So I was always very interested in that culture. And then just being able to get the opportunity to be able to study abroad in Argentina for a year, learn Spanish, and really get deeper into the culture was a big game changer for me, and it made me kind of want to go back to Latin America at some point. I had a detour also in Spain, working at Santander Bank, where I worked more in kind of a formal Spanish setting. But then, yeah, I came back to the States, and I knew I still wanted to one day go back to Latin America at some point. So I applied for the Fulbright, and I think I was just fortunate to get it and be able to kind of build on that to then, from what I learned, launch Finerio in a way that I thought would make sense for Latin Americans. So I think it's always been a source of inspiration. I always love the culture. I love the potential, right? I think it's kind of like the Wild West a little bit when it comes to business. So I just had lots of different ideas that I wanted to test out here, and Finerio wound up being kind of the one that I landed on.
So you had the idea to go to Latin America, but how important is having a co-founder from Mexico, like you have with Jose, in the process of building a startup as an American in Mexico?
Yeah, well, I think at the time it was very important for me to have someone that I felt like had the cultural context of Mexico, and what that looked like. So and also the legal processes and accounting, and there's lots of things that like are very, very local in that way, that you might not have any background for. So yeah, and I think having a co-founder is just super important in general. I think having someone there to be able to support, and be able to kind of lean on each other. So I think it is pretty important to have teams that are complementary at the end of the day, and whether that's local and foreigner, or that's technical and non-technical. I think it's just a matter of finding out how the pieces fit together. But I do think the foreigners here in Latin America have been very successful in terms of raising lots of rounds, or larger rounds. They've done Endeavor did a study on this, in Mexico and in Latin America in general, I believe, and those with a foreigner in the founding group actually raised much more. So I think it's always good to have that perspective from the outside and from the inside, because then you're starting to combine strengths of both, right? You're starting to be very ambitious about what you can do in the market, but you're also being realistic about what is this market capable of sustaining, and what is it that it wants, right? So I think if you can combine those two things, ideally, that's a great combination.
So what do you think the biggest surprise about Mexico or Latin America that you've encountered during the last 6.5 years that you've lived there in Mexico City? What would that be?
The biggest surprise has been, I would say, the pace at which things have started to move. Yeah, it's kind of irrecognizable, the city from 6 years ago to what it is today, in terms of just the amount of people working in startups and the culture around it. I remember when we first started, we had to convince people, that like joining a startup wasn't like super risky or like dangerous or whatever. Like there was just no idea of what that was, and everyone was kind of very attached to this idea of like prestigious old kind of corporations and working at one of those, and whether that was a consultancy or whatever. So I think for us it's changed a lot, just in terms of the level of competition, the level of conscientiousness around startup culture and all that type of stuff. And just the level of services as a consumer too. So I think it's just been incredible to watch that grow.
So how do you deal with the cultural barriers, if any, between you and your Latin American colleagues?
Well, I've been here long enough at this point that I think there's not too many. I think, yeah, in general, if you can, if you have a good domination of the language, then you'll be okay. I do think it's important to speak Spanish or whatever the local language is, or if it's Portuguese in Brazil. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're all humans, and the culture here is pretty similar to that of the U.S. It's just a little bit more laid back and got its finer points. But it is a culture that I think a lot of people can identify with, especially if you're from the U.S. and Latinos are a big part of the U.S. at this point. So I think more than anything, it's just around being able to speak the language and being able to be direct in a way that sometimes other cultures aren't as direct. So I think for Americans, we're used to a little bit more directness and things like that. That's more or less kind of the one thing that I find that I have to be conscientious of.
You mentioned on the interpersonal aspect just now, the directiveness, but at a more kind of larger 30,000 foot view, what's the biggest thing that you've learned about running a business in Latin America that maybe the average American venture capitalist or operator wouldn't know?
I would say that it is a game that requires a lot of nuances that you might not expect in the US. So whether that's building relationships with your clients or building relationships with the regulators, or just kind of building local partnerships, things like that. I think it's very much a market where it's based on, again, trust, and the way that you build trust is through branding, but also through personal connection. I think in Latin America, or I think in the US at least, like we underestimate the power of that, especially in startups where things are productized, and it's kind of like a self-service model. I think in Latin America things are a little bit more manual. Cost of labor is cheaper. There are people doing things that robots do in the US still, and also just that's going to change. But I think basically the idea is that you need to get in on the ground level with a lot of these organizations and really put in a lot of the dirty work at a local level and a networking level, and these things take time. So I think sometimes if you come in with the attitude that, like, here's my product, take it or leave it, it's a little harder to sell than in Latin America than if you come in with a more local perspective or with somebody who already has a lot of connections. That I think that's really important.
So you mentioned a little bit about the difference in funding amongst American founders versus Latin American, founders themselves. You're part of that sub community of Americans who founded companies in Latin America. What common traits do you see in yourself and other successful peers who've gone abroad to build a startup?
Well, perseverance. I think perseverance, determination. You have to have your dream in mind and your goal in mind. And I know guys who have been at this for 10 plus years, 20 plus years, and some of them have had just one company, some of them have had multiple. But I think overall, like, the theme is that they never sit still, and they're always kind of trying to go forward, you have to be very, very perseverant as a founder, no matter where you are in the world. And very flexible in that way, especially in Latin America, where you can have multiple things, unexpected things happen, or communication issues, or things like that. So I think in general, you just have to be very, very perseverant and flexible when it comes to the long term.
Okay, so finally, I must ask Peter Thiel's famous question, but with a uniquely Semilla.VC twist. What important truth about Mexico or Latin America do very people agree with you on?
Yeah, I would say that, I think that the future of Latin America is going to be around data and around automizing a lot of this data. But there's also going to be a lot of manual components that we're going to have to start to kind of replicate. And so I think data is going to be very, very important, but I think we're going to have to slowly but surely kind of adapt them to ways that Latin Americans understand, and whether that's through sending their bank statements through WhatsApp, or sending it through a text message or an email. And we've kind of adapted a lot of our products in that way, in a way that like most US and Europeans, companies that do what we do haven't. I think what we're seeing is that a lot of users have these tendencies already baked in, and if you can kind of start to automate a lot of those tendencies without changing their behavior, then that's really kind of where you're going to start to win in a lot of ways where others might not be aware of. So I think in general, just Latin Americans, they don't like to change their behavior super quickly. So if you can adapt your services to that, I think that's the way to go, rather than trying to force some sort of model from the outside on them.
Okay. Well, Nick, that's the end of our interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it. You are our first guest on Semilla.VC. We'll see where this goes, but you were the first person, so you were the seed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No problem. Anytime.
Well, that was it. That was the first episode of the Semilla.VC podcast, hosted by me, Trip Gorman, with Nick Grassi, CEO of Finerio Connect. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Check out more at Semilla.VC, or check me out on LinkedIn, Trip Gorman. And it was a pleasure having you listen, and hopefully you're back for the next episode.